Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Monday, October 26, 2020. Your humble host is recovering from an intentional power outage. Last night about 7 p.m., our rogue utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, shut off the power at our house while leaving it on for many of our neighbors. Now, I understand the risk. We had wind gusts up to 70 miles an hour last night, creating severe risk of wildfires. But the arbitrary way that they choose who gets cut off and who doesn't, well, because I was one of the people blacked out, you can imagine that I have questions. So I didn't get to see the 60 Minutes interview, the edited version of Trump's walkout on Leslie Stahl, or the treatment of Biden and Harris. I'll try to catch up with that when my power is back on. So I want to lead today with a fascinating piece by Ben Smith in yesterday's New York Times. And Ben Smith was once the editor-in-chief at Buzzfeed. He's the man who made the decision to release the Steele dossier. And so it's curious that he, who now focuses mostly on media issues in occasional columns at the Times, decided to celebrate the return of the gatekeepers, the corporate media gatekeepers. And he's using the example of the broad suppression of reporting in mainstream media outlets on the Hunter Biden laptop discovery, Rudy Giuliani's role in feeding that to the New York Post, and how that led the Wall Street Journal to back off from the reporting that it had been working on. And that aspect of it, I've linked to the story, and you're free to read that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that particular episode. But Smith uses that as an example of responsible journalism. And he celebrates the Wall Street Journal's decision to essentially downplay these discoveries. Now, let me first say that I don't have a lot invested in the credibility of Rudy Giuliani, the legally blind computer repair shop owner in Wilmington, Delaware. The curious question of why Hunter would drop a laptop in Wilmington when he's been living in Los Angeles for at least a couple of years. So it's a story with many holes. And it comes as a late, suspicious, political hit on Joe Biden. But in my view, that does not justify suppression of this story. And Smith does criticize Twitter for its excessive response by initially just cutting off any posts that referred to the New York Post tabloid story on this. So he writes, in 2015, the old gatekeepers had entered a kind of crisis of confidence, believing they couldn't control the online news cycle any better than King Canute could control the tides. Television networks all but let Donald Trump take over as executive producer that summer and fall. In October 2016, Julian Assange and James Comey seemed to drive the news cycle more than the major news organizations. Many figures in old media and new bought into the idea that in the new world, readers would find the information they wanted to read, and therefore, decisions by editors and producers about whether to cover something and how much attention to give it didn't mean much. But, says Ben Smith, the last 2 weeks have proved the opposite, that the old gatekeepers, like the Wall Street Journal, can still control the agenda. It turns out there's a big difference between WikiLeaks and establishment media coverage of WikiLeaks, a difference between a Trump tweet and an article about it, even between an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal suggesting Biden had done bad things and a news article that didn't reach that conclusion. This last part I mentioned, I think, on Friday, that there was a disconnect between the editorial page's attack on Biden and the reporting that essentially dismissed this late-breaking Hunter Biden scandal. So Smith goes on to say, perhaps the most influential media document of the last 4 years is a chart by the co-director of the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, Yochai Benkler. The study showed that a dense new right-wing media sphere had emerged, and that the mainstream news revolved around the agenda that the right-wing media sphere set. Now, Smith acts like that is something new. Fox News, Breitbart, Rush Limbaugh, they have had a coordinated agenda for, I don't know how far Breitbart doesn't go all the way back to 2000, but, this agenda setting by the right has been a feature of right-wing rule in this country for all too long. And he describes how Steve Bannon knew this. His strategy was to float stories and try to get them published by the Times and the Post. Ben Smith talks about, in 2015, the book Clinton Cash by a right-wing ally, Peter Schweitzer, was an investigation of the Clinton family's blurring of business, philanthropic, and political interest. Now, Schweitzer is a political hack, but some of what he published is true. And so Smith writes, Schweitzer is still around this cycle, but you won't find his work in mainstream outlets. He's over on Breitbart with a couple of Hunter Biden stories this month. So, near the end of his screed here, Ben Smith expresses what he calls deep ambivalence. I spent my career before arriving at the Times this past March on the other side of the gate, lobbing information past it to a very online audience who I presumed had already seen the leak or the rumor, and seeing my job as helping to guide that audience through the thicket, not to close their eyes to it. The media's new and unfamiliar job is to provide a framework for understanding the wild, unvetted, and incredibly intoxicating information that its audience will inevitably see, not to ignore it. And that's a quote from a former Buzzfeed colleague who's been recruited by the Times as well, named John Herman with 2 R's. And back to Ben Smith's voice, this fall, top media and tech executives were bracing to refight the last war, a foreign-backed hack and leak operation like WikiLeaks, seeking to influence the election's outcome. It was that hypervigilance that led Twitter to block links to the Post's article about Biden, a frighteningly disproportionate response to a story that other news organizations were handling with care. Now, this is yellow journalism promotion. To celebrate handling with care a story? No, that speaks to managing the news, massaging the news, framing it around a predetermined point of view, like a pro-Biden point of view, like protecting Joe Biden. That is not the function of the media, whether it's a little podcast like mine or a big newspaper like the New York Times. And since I mentioned Buzzfeed, I want to laud them for a great piece of investigative reporting that is published today under the byline of Salvador Hernandez. And it ties together the activities of what had appeared to be unconnected shootings by members of the so-called Boogaloo Boys. And he ties together the incident that occurred in Minneapolis, where a Boogaloo boy named Ivan Harrison Hunter, who had traveled from Texas, he's 26 years old, had an AK-47-style rifle, and he blasted 13 shots into that 3rd precinct building while looters were inside. Hunter is facing a count of participating in a riot, and it's clear that he was under FBI surveillance. And I will say, after many, many years of criticizing the FBI, that this is the appropriate way to use your undercover informants to deal with violence-prone white extremist groups in this country, not profiling Muslims who you then frame for bogus and purported plots of domestic terrorism. So we learn of the direct connection between Hunter, the Texan who went to Minneapolis with his assault rifle, and Stephen Carrillo, He is the military police guy. He was assigned to Travis Air Force Base here in California. And he went on a boogaloo mission, if you want to call it that, to Oakland at the height of the early George Floyd protests, and he killed a Federal Protective Service officer, a security guard named David Underwood. And Carrillo was then picked up after a manhunt by sheriffs in Santa Cruz County, which is, 60 miles, 50 miles at least, from Oakland. And according to Brian Levin, who is director for the Center of the Study of Hate and Extremism at CSU, that's California State University, San Bernardino, he said, this now tells us the Boogaloo Boys are more than just a bunch of unconnected extremists. And the evidence is that a few hours after Hunter shot up that precinct in Minneapolis, he was Facebook messaging Stephen Carrillo here in California. And the coded message, Hunter, boog. Carrillo, did. Hunter, go for police buildings. Carrillo, I did better. Now, in this exchange, Carrillo doesn't quite explain how he did better, but he actually shot and killed in cold blood this security guard, David Underwood. And a little bit later, Hunter sent a Facebook message to Carrillo saying that he needed some cash. And Carrillo sent him $200 on the same day that he ended up in a shootout with those Santa Cruz sheriff deputies, one of whom died. So this is a vignette, right? It's an anecdote. It doesn't give us any full dimension of what Boogaloo Boys are capable of, how deep their network runs, how well organized they are, if there is a command and control operation. But it shows that there is some coordination between at least some members of the so-called Boogaloo movement. And I think it deserves much further investigation. And the reason I paired this up with the Ben Smith story celebrating gatekeepers is the gatekeepers need to lower those gates and get on the stick and really bear down and investigate serious operations like the Boogaloo Boys, the 3%ers, and it's not like they've ignored them entirely. But I would like to see a lot more invested in exposing these dangerous, armed, right-wing extremist groups. One of the other themes in the New York Times, at least today, there are two different posts about QAnon. And one of them is a 10-minute video produced by a guy named Kirby Ferguson, who I've never heard of. He's described as a documentary filmmaker. And he exposes some of what QAnon talks about, what kind of attracts their adherents. And he gives advice that trying to humiliate people who are sympathetic or interested in the QAnon narrative risks moving them into the shadows, where they will continue to consume the product of QAnon, but they simply won't tell you about it. Well, I have an even better takedown, and I have to give credit once again to our friend in Melbourne, Australia, Mark the Boat Builder, who sent me a link to the latest Juice Media video. I'm going to play part of it here, but I've linked to the full video in the show file for this podcast, and I strongly encourage that you watch it so that you get the sight gags along with the satirical narrative.
Hello, I'm from the U.S. government. Does something feel wrong in the world, but you can't put your finger on it? Are you yearning to fight injustice and be part of something bigger? Do you do your own research? If so, you've been chosen to participate in our new PSYOP. QAnon. PSYOPs are usually carried out by our intelligence agencies in countries we've invaded or whose governments we've overthrown, in order to convince the local population that we're there to help them. QAnon is just like that, except the target isn't a foreign population. It's you. And the government we're planning to overthrow is Follow the white rabbit. At the heart of this psyop is Q, a government insider who will give you advance warning about major events, like the arrest of Hillary and deep state leaders, which never happened, and the end of the Democratic Party in 2018, who actually went on to win the House that year. And if years of fake predictions start to get you down, don't worry. Trust the plan. The best part of this psyop is you'll believe you're in a psyop, except that's not the psyop you're actually in, but the psyop where we let you think you're in a psyop. Psyopception. All we have to do is tell Il Duce to say tip top next to a white rabbit. Q-proof. Joining QAnon is easy because at its core there are some truths. Like, the media really does lie to you. There really are powerful predators out there, and there really is a global pedophile ring that ritually abuses kids. But as you follow Q's droppings, you'll gradually LARP yourself deep into the rabbit's rectum, where you'll find others who yearn to fight injustice just like you. The 5G crew, the Plandemic crowd, the FEMA camps, and chemtrail folks too, all LARP together into a single LARP we can control. Where we LARP one, we LARP all. In exchange for all this entertainment and newfound sense of purpose, all we ask for in return is your help. No, you fucking idiots, not to arrest Hillary. You see, we have no intention of ceding power at this election. So if it looks like we're winning on election night, we'll declare victory, even though millions of votes are still being counted. And if we're losing, we'll declare the election rigged. Either way, that's your cue to get in the streets and prevent further mail-in ballots from being counted. Just like what happened in Florida when rioters shut down the recount of the 2000 election. Among those rioters was this fuckwit, the same one who is now urging us to declare martial law should we lose the election.
Roger
and among
Stone.
the lawyers who helped to stop the recount was the same one we're pushing hard to appoint to the Supreme Court right now. Coincidence?
So this is a powerful, well-written, and well-executed piece of satire. What Juice Media does from Australia to critique American politics is nothing short of brilliant. And I have to note that many of the themes in here echo the in-depth interview that's currently available without a subscription at peterbcollins.com with journalist Greg Palast. We talk about many of these issues in our most recent conversation. And Greg also expresses his concerns, which we'll amplify a little bit later, about Supreme Court interference in the local and state election processes and the risks, especially to Democrats, of the heavy reliance on mail-in balloting by people who largely have never done it before. So do check out the Juice Media video. It runs a little under 4 minutes, and it really is quite impressive and very, very effective. Another report, this one from the New York Times, they did a good job of breaking down the source of the campaign funding for both Biden and Trump campaigns. And Biden's strongest support comes overwhelmingly from the two coasts. Trump's financial base is in Texas. And it is amazing, for example, in zip codes with a median household income of at least $100,000, Biden has smashed Trump in fundraising by a count of $486 million to $167 million. Of the zip codes where at least 65% of people had graduated from college, Biden outraised Trump by $478 million to $104 million. And below that education level, Trump is ahead by about $40 million. This analysis looked at more than 25 million contributions from April 1st until October 14th, so it's pretty fresh. And in the overall count, Biden has raised just over $1 billion and Trump $734 million in the past 6 months. And Biden's financial edge can be accounted for in 4 states: California, New York, Massachusetts, and Washington State. Now, another way of divining the difference between these two campaigns is a Buzzfeed story today, which notes that Trump and Pence are still using the big mob rallies, mostly with people who don't bother to maintain a little distance or wear a mask. And there have been studies that show that where Trump goes, an uptick in the virus follows. And Trump has routinely made fun of the Biden-Harris campaign for their small crowds. But it is true that they're not trying to gather people in large configurations. And we don't know if they could draw a big crowd if they tried. It's kind of untested in this campaign cycle. And the other day in Cleveland, Kamala Harris was there. And in order to find a crowd, they gave her a cordless mic, and she walked down a lineup of people who were lining up for early voting. They were kind of a captive audience. But it appeared most of them were pretty friendly to Harris and Biden. Oh, and get this. Trump held a mob rally in Circleville. That's a city of 14,000 outside Columbus, Ohio. And Circleville had canceled its annual pumpkin show. It's a 5-day festival leading up to Halloween. So they traded one orange orb that draws a crowd for Trump. I think you get my drift there. And, of course, his rallying call at the mob gatherings all over the weekend were, the media only wants to talk about COVID. And part of that is because he goes to places where COVID cases and hospitalizations are rising significantly. The Washington Post, under the byline of Philip Pump today, did I say Pump? It's Bump. I'm sorry, Philip Bump. Talks about the way the Trump campaign has to cherry-pick the poll numbers they use to reassure their mobs. Trump told a rally in North Carolina in an unguarded moment, he said, you know, when I like the polls, I like to get them in my favor, and then I like them, right? When they come in my favor, I repeat them all the time. I say they're great. And when they're not in my favor, I don't. I don't discuss them. And Bump says, as of this writing, even if the polls are as wrong as they were in 2016 in each state, Biden will win the presidency with more than 300 electoral votes. I almost said electrical there. And I'm not so sure about that. When you dive into the numbers, the races are tightening, and I've got something in the stack here that will address that in a moment. But when you look at the messages that are being promoted by the Trump campaign, I'm picking up a couple of obvious trends. Don, the stable genius, is playing the sexism game. At his rally in Allentown, Pennsylvania, he offered caustic, negative appraisals of prominent women. He started by hammering Kamala Harris. Then he went on to Leslie Stahl, Savannah Guthrie, Nancy Pelosi. Then she circled back to Harris. She said she will not be the first woman president. You can't let that happen. You can't let that happen. At a different rally in Florida last week, he attacked Harris with a gratuitous reference to her gender, saying the country didn't need a socialist president, especially a female socialist president. Then he referenced 60 Minutes again. It was a total joke of a show. Did you see Biden's performance on that show? The only thing almost as bad was Kamala with the laugh. Oh, that's so funny. She kept laughing. I said, is there something wrong with her, too? Now, it's fair to say that Kamala Harris does have a stage giggle. We saw it a lot in the Democratic primary debates before she dropped out. And we also saw it in her debate with Mike Pence. But as I pointed out after the Pence debate, I do think, and by the way, this comment came from the manager of my dentist's office, that she wants to try very hard not to come across as an angry woman. And so it seems that the giggles, some of the forced laughter, and the big smile appear to be an intentional way to offset that potential. So Crown Prince Jared, he's not working sexism. He's got that not-so-subtle racism. So the Crown Prince went on Foxy Friends today. He made comments seeming to question whether black Americans want to be successful. Quote, one thing we've seen in a lot of the black community, which is mostly Democrat, is that President Trump's policies are the policies that can help people break out of the problems that they're complaining about. But he can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful. This led to a quick reaction from African Americans. This dismissive approach to the issues that black voters care about is indicative of Trump's callousness and disregard for the lives of black people. That comment comes from Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia. There's also a lot of promotion in right-wing media right now about voter fraud stories, and I see them show up on Facebook from my pro-Trump friends. They are led to believe that voter fraud is rampant when election fraud is being conducted by the Republicans in every way they can conceive of. One example we have here, the New York Post back in August published an article that relied on a single anonymous source identified as a Democratic operative who claimed that he had engaged in voter fraud for decades. And that went wide in the Blaze, Breitbart, Daily Caller, FoxNews.com, the Washington Examiner. And so this is a serious issue where they create a perception that is clearly not based in reality. Well, this surprised me a little bit. It used to be called the Manchester Union Leader, but it's been rebranded as the New Hampshire Union Leader, and it's been the arch-conservative voice of New England for almost 100 years. In an editorial on Sunday, they said that while Trump is not always 100% wrong, he is 100% wrong for America. And it's the first time the Union Leader has ever endorsed a Democrat. And for your daily adult minimum dose of irony, I have linked to a column by George T. Conway III, published in today's Washington Post. He, of course, is the notorious Mr. Kellyanne Conway. And this is brilliant. He said, I believe more than ever in the president. I believe Sleepy Joe Biden and that monster Kamala Harris would turn America into a socialist hellhole, and we'll all have to speak Chinese. I believe they want to take out the cows and any form of animals. There'll be no airplanes. They'll rip down the Empire State Building, and we'll only have little tiny windows. I believe Giuliani was just tucking in his shirt in the Borat movie. And let me add, I watched the Borat movie, and it was a disappointment. If you have a 90 minutes to kill, you can watch it, but I don't think it scored like any of his previous films. Back to Conway. I believe Harris is nasty, a communist, and a mad woman. These are all quotes from Trump, in case you haven't guessed. I believe we can't have a socialist president, especially a female socialist president. You know the source of that quote. I believe the president is the least racist person in any room he's in. I believe it was fine for him to tell the Proud Boys to stand by, and because somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left. I believe Corona sounds like a beautiful seaside island in Italy, and so we must say China plague. And in his final few lines, I believe the ballots are out of control and people should vote by mail and then vote again in person to test the system. I believe the president will not only win, but he'll also negotiate a third term, which he's entitled to because Obama and Biden spied on him. I believe that if the president does somehow lose, he might have to leave the country. I believe he probably should. Feel free to share that one. With that in mind, two angles on the damage that Trump has done to the Republican Party. There is a new study that was conducted by a university that you probably never heard of. It's in Sweden. It is the University of Gothenburg, and they have the V-Dem Institute. One of the leaders there is Anna Luhrmann. She said that the transformation of the Republican Party has been the most dramatic shift in an established democracy, and that the Republican Party has become dramatically more illiberal in the last 20 years and now more closely resembles ruling parties in autocratic societies than its former center-right equivalents in Europe. And she compares the Republicans of 2020 to the party, the BJP of India's Narendra Modi, the party called Fidesz, which under Viktor Orban has evolved from a liberal youth movement into an authoritarian party in Hungary. to make it the first non-democracy in the European Union? So it is a fascinating study, and they conclude that for the first time this century, autocracies are in the majority, holding power in 92 countries that are home to 54% of the global population. So more than half of the world is living under authoritarian rule, and we're heading there. Sunday's New York Times sole editorial was headlined, RIP GOP, and it is a long list of the damage that Trump has done to the grand old party. I'll pull a couple of quotes here. Having long preached character and family values, Republicans have given a pass to Trump's personal degeneracy. The affairs, the hush money, the multiple accusations of assault and harassment, the gross boasts of grabbing unsuspecting women, none of it matters. White evangelicals remain especially faithful adherents, in large part because Trump has appointed about 200 judges to the federal bench. For all their talk about revering the Constitution, Republicans have stood by slack-jawed in the face of the president's assault on checks and balances. Trump has spurned the concept of congressional oversight of his office. They talk about the phony national emergency that he used to divert money from the Pentagon to pay for the wall. Then they talk about Ukraine. And near the end, the editorial says, but many of these disillusioned Republicans also acknowledge that their team has been descending into white grievance, revanchism, and know-nothing populism for decades. Trump just greased the slide. And I think all of that is true. Next, I want to take a look at the people who don't vote. And in this, I also want to send a message to people who try to shame people like me into voting the way they think I should. First and foremost, I think that our vote is a prized personal possession, and nobody can tell you what to do with it, including deciding not to use it. And this story focuses on Monroe County in northeastern Pennsylvania and a woman named Fedrick. Her name is Kiana Fedrick. And she gets pilloried all the time because she didn't vote in 2016, and she's threatening not to vote this year. Across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, more than 3.5 million eligible voters did not cast ballots for president in 2016. And this is the point I want to make. When people try to lecture me because I choose to cast a protest vote, as I did against Hillary, and as I just did against Joe Biden, now I do that from the comfort of California, where no Democrat could possibly lose. But I have the right to do that even if I live in a battleground state. And my choice not to vote for Biden is my choice. And you don't have any power over that. You don't get to second-guess me. You don't get to try to shame me or try to demagogue me into a kind of forced orthodoxy. Your problem is not with me or Green Party voters or even, people who vote for libertarians. Your problem is with the people who choose not to vote at all, who are registered to your damn party. So, for example, in Michigan, where the margin of victory alleged for Trump was just under 11,000, there were 2.6 million eligible non-voters. Now, that comprises both parties, but you can figure that that's over at least 1 million Democrats. In Wisconsin, a state that Trump showed a margin of 23,000. Eligible non-voters, 1.3 million. So if there are people who you want to persuade to think like you and act like you, don't talk to me. Work on those registered people who choose not to vote. And here is an ad that an individual named Amitai Etzioni took out in the Sunday New York Times, addressed to progressive non-voters. And he said that he's talked to all kinds of people and why they're planning not to vote for Biden. And he writes in bold type, while the good that Biden may do may be limited, the harm that Trump will inflict is unlimited. And he falsely argues a few thousand votes for Nader cost Al Gore the 2000 election. In 2016, 12% of Sanders supporters voted for Trump, enough to ensure his election. This is presumptuous. Each individual gets to cast their ballot according to their own decision. Please, don't engage in this kind of demagoguery. You can persuade people. You can articulate why you have chosen to vote the way you're going to. But don't try to interfere in my personal decision. All right? Sermon's over. Next, I want to warn you that the good news is that the Democrats are likely to regain control of the Senate. And the bad news is the senators who will be on the Democratic side are pretty damn conservative. In fact, I can't summon her name right now, but the woman who is running and is on track to win as a Democrat in Kansas was a registered Republican office holder 6 months ago. And when you look at Teresa Greenfield, the Democratic candidate in Iowa, who has raised almost $30 million in the past quarter, who is giving Joni Ernst, the pig farmer, a real run for her money, well, she is running on being opposed to Medicare for all, any kind of single-payer health insurance. She doesn't support the Green New Deal. She explicitly opposes expanding the number of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. And nevertheless, despite being a conservative, Joni Ernst is desperately trying to depict her as a dangerous liberal. And I don't know the quote here, but Ocasio-Cortez was on CNN yesterday, and she made a passing mention to Joni Ernst, poised to lose. That was taken by the Ernst campaign as a full endorsement by AOC of Teresa Greenfield, and they immediately pounced. Greenfield is a liberal who has the full support of AOC, the author of the Green New Deal. Teresa Greenfield supports extreme new environmental rules that would kill American jobs and hurt Iowa farmers, making clear that Greenfield is perfect for New York or California, but wrong for Iowa. And this is the case no matter who is running. And it's why I deplore the fear that so many mainstream Democrats expressed over Bernie Sanders. Oh, he's too liberal. He's going to be dismissed and just beaten up because he's a socialist. Well, they call conservatives, like Mark Kelly in Arizona, a socialist. And so I'm hopeful that Mitch McConnell will no longer be the majority leader in the Senate come January. But it comes at a price, because once again, to achieve this, the Democrats have backed people who don't identify with my view of the Democratic Party. They are corporate, they are moderate, they are conservative, and they'll carry the D label, but it means, and you know, you can't expect a President Joe Biden to put an extreme liberal on the Supreme Court. And if he did, he might not even have the votes of his own Senate Democratic caucus. So don't get too supercharged about a Democratic victory and taking back the U.S. Senate. And even Mitch McConnell is hinting that his days may be numbered. As he gloats about tonight's installation, there'll be the confirmation vote for Amy Coney Barrett. She will be officially invested as a Supreme Court justice. She is available to start work and promote her regressive agenda as soon as tomorrow. She will be a sitting justice on November 11th when the attack on Obamacare arrives for oral arguments at the Supreme Court. So McConnell is gloating, crowing. He says, "This is something to be really proud of and feel good about. We made an important contribution to the future of this country. A lot of what we have done over the last 4 years will be undone sooner or later by the next election. It won't be able to do much about this for a long time to come. So the hint there is that he knows that this is his last stand, at least for the time being, and that he is satisfied to trade his control over the Senate for a 30 or 40-year run for Amy Coney Barrett. I think that is a fascinating glimpse into the troubled mind of Mitch McConnell. And no, I don't know why he has purple hands and purple lips. It's not Halloween yet. And we do have to note that Lisa Murkowski has wriggled out of her commitment not to vote for this nominee before the election. The senator from Alaska, who, like the senator from Maine, Susan Collins, often tries to posture as a slightly better Republican, has once again shown her true colors. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Over the years, a lot of fine people have supported me, like Carl Howard, Jerry in Southeast Portland, Dave Derby, Siri Walgren. I thank each and every one of you. And as I get ready to hang up my headphones after we get a resolution to this election, I will always remember the people who have been there for me and with me in this podcast adventure. So, we're 8 days from the election, and the Republicans never give up. They never relent. They never stop their efforts to keep people from voting. In Alabama, an unknown number of absentee voters in the most populous county are at risk of having their ballots thrown out because election officials mailed special instructions that have been invalidated by a recent court ruling. And in Jefferson County, they allowed a small number of elderly and infirm voters to get out of the requirement that they had to have two witnesses witness their signature of their mail-in ballots. What happened is that a federal judge blocked the witness requirement. And on October 13th, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Atlanta reversed the order of the trial court judge. And this has left some unknown number of voters in limbo. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, Republican legislative leaders have requested intervention by the United States Supreme Court. They've argued that an extension of the deadline not to mail the ballots but for the election office to receive them is a usurpation of power. Quote, the question now before the U.S. Supreme Court is whether an unelected state panel should be able to change election laws after voting has already started. Well, this unelected panel is a bipartisan group, the State Elections Commission, and it's it appears, at least to me, to be well within its jurisdiction to make a decision like this. And the trial court judge wrote, there is no irreparable harm from a ballot extension. Everyone must submit their ballot by the same date. The extension merely allows more lawfully cast ballots to be counted. And we wouldn't want that, would we? And that's one of the many issues that I discussed with Greg Palast in our recent in-depth interview, which is available for everyone, no subscription required. You can find it at peterbcollins.com and most of our outlets. We also talk about the intervention by the Supreme Court in some of these really minor issues that can be handled at the state level. And it underscores that when the Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, overturned the actionable elements of the 1964 Voting Rights Act, that the very states that used to have to apply to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division before they could change voting rules are busy getting the Supreme Court to uphold their suppression tactics. And this includes Alabama, South Carolina, and Texas. And what's curious, as Adam Liptak, the court watcher for the New York Times, points out, is that the court is offering no explanation for the decisions that it imposes. And he describes how there is the what's called the merits docket. And those are the cases that the court agrees to hear, and they have oral arguments. It's all done in public. But emergency applications are in what court watchers call the shadow docket. And that's where all these election issues are being disposed of. And in the shadow docket, they don't have a full briefing. They don't hold oral arguments. The court issues a decision without any explanation. And they have the latitude to explain later if they choose to, but they're not required to. And a lot of this is because Trump routinely uses the emergency docket. He's filed 36 emergency applications in less than 4 years. And when you combine George W. Bush and Barack Obama's 16 years, they filed only 8 applications. So you can see that there's been I would call it an abuse, but an expansion of the use of the emergency docket, and that is where the Supreme Court acts in a dictatorial fashion. Also, Greg Palast spent quite a bit of time in our new interview talking about the risks of mail-in ballots being rejected. And at The Guardian today, Nathan Robinson airs out some of the same concerns in an op-ed that I've linked to in the show file for this podcast. And he says that the problem of mail-in balloting will hurt Democrats more than Republicans because more Democrats are using mail-in ballots by a rate of 47% to 11%. So the Democrats will be most likely to have ballots rejected. There can be challenges, and Palast talks about how the Republicans routinely will challenge every damn ballot that's cast for a Democratic candidate. And Robinson notes the usual fears of voter fraud are ill-founded, but that the problems with mail-in ballots, particularly with people who aren't familiar with them, are significant. And in a Sunday graphic in the editorial section, the New York Times laid out a number of the issues that show up related to signatures and whether they match the one that's on file, whether the witness, if it's required, has been properly signed as expected. In some states, you have to put your ballot inside an envelope that goes inside the envelope that gets mailed. And if you don't do that, it's called a naked ballot, and it's rejected. In some states, particularly for first-time voters, you have to send a photocopy of your picture ID. And so there are many challenges to successfully casting a mail-in ballot, and we're going to find out just how bad it is over the next few weeks. It's not going to be all determined on election night. That is for sure. There is other news today. Last week, we alerted you to the executive order that by fiat significantly alters the protections of civil service for government workers. And it creates the prospect that at federal agencies, there'll be far more political appointees who, number one, will be loyal to the president who is on duty at the time, and number two, can be fired without cause, which makes them even more averse to doing anything that would cause them to get attention or be seen as not on the team. So we have the first resignation. Ronald Sanders is a Republican appointee. Trump put him in charge of the Federal Salary Council, and he resigned yesterday. I simply cannot be part of an administration that seeks to replace apolitical expertise with political obeisance. Career federal employees are legally and duty-bound to be nonpartisan. They take an oath to preserve and protect our Constitution and the rule of law, not to be loyal to a particular president or administration. And this guy Sanders is no relation to Bernie. He's held senior positions at the Pentagon, the IRS, the Office of Personnel Management, and at least he has some principles. And he said, as a lifelong Republican, he cannot in good conscience continue to serve this administration. Trump's order seeks to make loyalty to him the litmus test for many thousands of career civil servants, and this is something I cannot be part of. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis, a retired civil servant. And I appreciate the work you put in on a daily basis, Linda, I really do. So the numbers continue to grow. We have almost 43 million worldwide cases with 1.152 million reported deaths attributed to COVID-19. Here in the United States, the total case count is up to 8.6 million. 63,000 new cases reported on Sunday. That number peaked at 79,000 on Friday, which is the highest number of new cases we have seen in a single day since the start of the pandemic. In the United States, as I've pointed out, the number of deaths is frequently lower at the beginning of the week, and it rises as the week goes on. I don't know why it's not more evenly distributed, but we're showing a total of 224,600 deaths, 380 new deaths reported on Sunday, and currently we have 42,000 people hospitalized, which is a 40% increase just since September. Yesterday, El Paso, Texas officials announced a stay-at-home order, a county-wide curfew, 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. It doesn't apply to people traveling to or from work. Quote, "Our hospitals are now at a point where they are overwhelmed and exhausted. I am left with no choice but to take this next step in hopes of seeing some stability and, most importantly, to save lives." That is the top county official, Judge Ricardo Samaniego, at a Sunday press conference. The editor-in-chief of The Lancet, Richard Horton, has called COVID-19 a syndemic. Now, you may recall the Irishman that I've played some clips from, who refers to the European spread, at least until the recent spikes, as a case-demic. Syndemic is defined as a synergistic epidemic of a new and deadly infectious disease, plus numerous underlying health problems, and the U.S. is squarely at the center of that syndemic. The Global Burden of Disease Project, a massive database of what kills and sickens people around the world, which published its latest figures last week for 2019, showed high blood pressure, obesity, and metabolic disorders are all on the rise in the United States. Life expectancy is at 65.5 years in the U.S. now, more than 2 decades behind Japan. 65,000 Americans died of a drug overdose in 2019, more than double the number in 2010. We have a new breakout at the White House, this time in the orbit of the vice president, and the former Freedom Caucus leader, now White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, confirmed to CNN yesterday, "Yeah, I did try to cover this up." And he blamed it on protecting private personal information. But it's clear that the White House is trying to keep the lid on everything they can as the election closes in, and COVID-19 is not the strong suit that you can trump the election with, if you'll pardon the puns from the bridge game. And Meadows also blurted out on CNN, "We are not going to control the pandemic." Joe Biden pounced on that and said that that is a white flag of surrender. And they have traced, the Washington Post did its own contact tracing. Last Tuesday, Marty Obst, Pence's top political advisor, tested positive after flying aboard Air Force Two with Pence. Then his body man, Zach Bauer, who had been in close proximity to Obst, tested positive. That led to Mark Short, the VP's chief of staff. He tested positive on Saturday afternoon. He blames Obst. And so far, nobody is blaming the Gold Star families for this one. But according to the Washington Post reporter team, some in the VP's office suggested the White House doctors should release a statement saying that Short was positive and that Pence was still okay to travel, but that was scuttled by Meadows and others. And Pence is continuing to fly around the country and hold mob rallies, despite, he claims he tested negative on Sunday. But there are concerns, and also there's an effort by Democrats to keep Mike Pence from coming to preside over the Senate for the final confirmation vote for Amy Coney Barrett, which is scheduled for early this evening. And Trump is on the defensive, and of course that means he gets offensive. He said Monday the administration is still working to curb the spread of the coronavirus. Speaking to reporters after arriving in Allentown, he addressed the controversial remarks from Mark Meadows. Asked if he had given up, he said, no, not at all. In fact, the opposite. Absolutely the opposite. We've done an incredible job. And on Monday again, he repeated that we are rounding the corner into a second and deeper phase. And that phase is centered in rural communities. The top 5 spike zones remain North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Montana, and Guam. And in a chart published in the New York Times Sunday, Norton, Kansas, population 5,486, has the dubious honor of the highest per capita caseload in the country at 72 per 100,000. Bonham, South Dakota, population's under 7,000. They're number 2 with 33 cases per 100,000. Followed by Falk, South Dakota, Sheridan, Kansas, Harding, South Dakota, Minor, South Dakota, Buffalo, South Dakota, Oglala, Lakota, South Dakota, Carter, Montana, and Roosevelt, Montana. Meanwhile, the occupation of hospital beds in this country by COVID-19 patients is reaching capacity in some areas. And in Wisconsin, they've set up a field hospital. We've already talked about El Paso, which has maxed out. There are also some communities in Utah where there are no ICU beds remaining. And looking around the world, workers and students in Belarus have launched strikes after weeks, well, actually months of protests over the continued stay of strongman Alexander Lukashenko. The opposition had given him till yesterday to step down. He did not. So they're expanding protests, calling on workers and students to strike. And as I look at that, I ask, if Trump holds on to power illegitimately during the month of November and into December, will the American left take to the streets? Will Democrats call a general strike? I don't think so. Because, hey, the voice is on. This is curious. Over the weekend, a report that some of the key activists who were leading the protests in Hong Kong over the past year have been granted asylum in the United States. Now, I do not object to this. But what I object to is the racist standard of the Trump administration, because they have succeeded in Stephen Miller's wildest dreams. They have shut down asylum almost 100%. We have reduced the acceptance of refugees to a meager 15,000 a year, when we have led or instigated the creation of refugees, in many cases with the worldwide count up to 65 million. But there are a number of people from Hong Kong who were fast-tracked for asylum here in the United States. And it raises the question, how much was the CIA involved in the protests in Hong Kong? And were these individuals organic protesters? Or did they have the support, the covert support of the United States all along? And was there a guarantee for asylum, or at least refugee status, if these people had to leave Hong Kong? And that leads to this other question. Did the CIA foment protests in Hong Kong, which have led to this massive crackdown, which is far from the interests of the United States in any way, shape, or form? Well, I hope someday we'll have answers. And finally, I want to recommend a powerful video interview conducted by Max Blumenthal. It's posted today at the Gray Zone Project from the trip that he and Ben Norton and Anya Preapel took to Bolivia for their election a week ago Sunday. The subject of the interview is a woman whose name is Patricia Arce. And she has been elected to the Senate in the nation of Bolivia. And she explains what hell has been like for the past year since last November 6th, the coup that was backed by the United States and the so-called Lima Group and the Organization of American States, claiming that Hugo Morales was not a legitimate elected leader. And she describes how she was targeted by armed gangs. They harassed her. They threw oil, gasoline, and red paint on her. They cut her hair off. They made her walk 7 kilometers barefoot. And the whole time they were hitting her. She spent some nights in jail. And she does not seek revenge, which is a remarkable thing. Check out the interview. There's a link to it in the show file for this podcast at peterbcollins.com. Thanks for listening all the way to the end of this news and comment podcast. Feel to share it everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.